Okay. Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Education System in Crisis. Tonight, we're going to focus on Black students in U.S. schools. We have a very special guest with us tonight, Anthony Downer, who is the co-chair of Gwinnett Educators for Equity and Justice, or GEEJ, will be here tonight to talk about various subjects from Black educators to organizing to curriculum. And so we're very excited to have him with us tonight. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. So since it is Black History Month, we want to talk about Black history in Gwinnett County, and specifically for Gwinnett County Public Schools. Hooper Renwick was the only public school that Black students could attend from 1944 to 1968. It was owned and built and run by Black people in Gwinnett County. The land was donated by Mark Renwick, who was a Black resident in Lawrenceville, and it was run by Professor Marshall Hooper, who was the first principal of Hooper Renwick. It's very important that Black students in Gwinnett County, we often feel like we're not welcome, or that this county and this district really isn't here for us. So it's important to know that Black people in Gwinnett County have been here for a long time, and we've been doing things to support each other and ensure that we have the resources that we need. In the pictures on the screen, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, you'll see kids playing basketball. That is a picture that was taken in 1953, and that was on the Hooper Renwick property. You'll see graduates from the class of 1953, and then you'll see at the top corner students in the Hooper Renwick Library. This school has now been permanently closed, and it will be turned into the only themed library in the Southeast. No mercy for Black children, deny the innocence of childhood. So I think it's important before we start talking about Black students in US schools, it's important for us to discuss how Black students are viewed by the society. And when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, when we talk about a lack of diverse teachers and curriculum, we talk about the fact that Black children are not fully valued, and they're often denied innocence and childhood. And this kind of sets the context of what Black children go through in the US every day. So in the past 2 weeks, there have been some really disturbing incidents that have happened to Black girls. One of them happened in Florida at Liberty High School in Osceola, Florida, where a SRO took a Black girl and slammed her to the ground because he thought that she was going to get into a fight with someone else. And she was knocked unconscious. And so this hyper aggressive, very violent approach to addressing any student behavior or any just student interactions is really exemplary of how the US approaches Black children and Black childhood. We have no mercy, no understanding for Black children, but as you see in the political world and as you see in society, there's so much understanding when adults make mistakes and break laws that are not Black. You've also probably heard about the 9-year-old Black girl who was harassed, assaulted by the Rochester police. They handcuffed her and pepper sprayed her. This was several police officers were around her. They handcuffed her and pepper sprayed her in the eyes, directly in the face. Even during that incident, they told her that she was acting like a child, and she said that she was a child. And so it's really important to understand that this society, white people do not view Black children as children. And especially when you're talking about Black girls, Black girls are hypersexualized, they're viewed as adults, and afforded very few protections. And so in addition to how we're treated, it's important to also talk about that there are many systems that fail Black children. And we're giving this background because it's important for us to understand that what we see happening in the education system is not isolated. It happens in many different systems. So in housing, healthcare, finance, and criminal justice, and education, which we will talk about more, there is a lot of discrimination towards Black families. We know that there is a Black maternal health crisis in the United States. So even from birth, Black children are facing adverse circumstances where Black women are ignored when they're in pain, when they're having birthing complications. And because of the way that they're treated, they die giving birth. In finance, we see that in banking and loans, Black families are denied housing, denied loans for businesses, denied financial opportunities that are easily and swiftly given away to white people, white families. And in the criminal justice system, we see how that extends into the education system through the school-to-prison pipeline. And so there are just many systems and many things that fail Black children. And so it's so important for us to get education, the opportunity to move forward in life, and to feel for Black children to reach their highest potential is very important for us to get that right, because so many other systems have failed them. So whenever we talk about organizing or any struggles related to civil rights and liberties for Black people, it's important that we do a race and class analysis. In education, the differences in the experience of Black students who attend predominantly Black and predominantly white school districts, that there are differences that they experience, but there are also many similarities as well. One of the commonalities is that no matter if you're in a majority Black school or majority white school, the resources, the district tends to keep away with the resources. So if you're in a majority Black school, there are just certain classes and certain things that they're not privy to. If you're in a majority white school, they concentrate those resources away from Black students, and they usually do that through gifted and advanced courses. So it's important to understand that race and class are important, but that race has class implications for Black people. For example, middle-class Black families do not receive the same protections and privileges as their white peers. An example of that, in a study done by the New School called Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, Why Studying and Working Harder Isn't Enough for Black Americans. Black people have completed a college degree. Black people who have completed a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white people who have never finished high school. So it's important to know that even when we do have, even when we do graduate and have certain levels of education, for example, the study also found that at every level of education, Black people have twice the unemployment rate of white people. So no matter if you didn't finish high school, to you have a PhD, or you graduated from professional school, you will still have twice the unemployment rate compared to white peers. So Black students in US schools, we see disparities in discipline. Disparities in discipline begin in preschool and continue through every level of schooling. While Blacks make up 18% of students in preschool, they account for 42% of students with an out-of-school suspension and 48% of students with multiple out-of-school suspensions. And that's from a US News article called Still Separate and Unequal. And so even when we are, now that some schools are integrated, because there still is a lot of segregation, but even for the schools that are integrated, Black students are punished significantly more. And then when we look at Gwinnett County, for example, using the most recent CRDC data available, and that's from the US Department of Education Civil Rights Data Collection, based on the school-related arrests in 2017 for students with disabilities, you see Black students receiving those arrests at a rate far greater than any other population. So that's just a background for what Anthony will be discussing, and how the United States, how this society views Black children, and why we have so many challenges in education. So I would like to welcome Anthony Downer, who is the co-chair of GEEJ. We're so excited to have you here and to hear what you have to say.
Well, thanks, Melody, and really thank you to Gwinnett SToPP for being such a strong partner, a reliable partner for our parents, our teachers, our students, everyone in the education system. And what you're painting, this picture that you're painting, simply put, is that at the root of the crisis in the education system are a trail of broken promises. And at times I'm going to talk about the nation at large, but I want to make this applicable to our own backyard, because with all of our talk, with all of our rhetoric, GCPS is not scot-free. They're not blame-free when it comes to these issues. And so I want to share two stories from two students that are near to dear in my heart, that really taught me how to be an educator. And they, I think, represent those broken promises at the crux of our education system. The first is Samara Massé, who passed away, unfortunately, in November of 2019. And she was this very vivacious, biracial Black girl who was very excited about learning, just very excited, not just about history, but about education, learning, knowing how much education could further her life and her career. But it was evident the school did damage to her spirit. And she would talk all the time about how her teachers were underestimating her, how they didn't call on her in class, that they wouldn't recommend her for honors courses. They critiqued her performance, her clothing, her behavior more often to her peers. She often sat in the back of her classes because of that fact. And just throughout just the one semester I saw her, I could see that her spirit was damaged more and more each day. And unfortunately, she won't get the chance to further her education. And that's why I fight so hard for students to be heard, for students to be represented, for them to have access to a high class, a high quality, world-class education. The second student, who's a senior now at Peachtree Ridge, where I teach, is one of my favorite students of all time. I hope I'm not out of bounds with saying that. But I remember this past year, with all that was going on, he texted me shortly. This was probably days after the lynching of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. He sent me this long text full of curse words, so I'll keep it PG, but he was frustrated. He said, I want my teachers to acknowledge what is going on in the world right now, because they're moving like nothing is happening. They acknowledge the Rona pandemic. This is a pandemic in and of itself. So as someone I'm supposed to respect, how I'm going to respect you if you aren't bringing attention to what's going on, especially when you know you have Black men in your class. I'm sitting here choked up, reading and listening to reports, and it made me realize that it hasn't been mentioned to me by any of my teachers once what is going on. I don't care what class you teach, but you need to take the initiative to make sure this is mentioned before we start talking about angles and radians. I don't care what else you have to talk about. His spirit was being damaged. And it was clear that because of the lack of diversity of his teachers, because of the lack of their training, because of the lack of the standard of culturally relevant pedagogy, that they were damaging his spirit and thus impacting his student achievement. And so that's where I'm going to emphasize today, that there's a long history of specific and intentional policy violence against our Black students that has resulted in extreme physical and mental instability and violence. And so when we look at this, we know that schooling in and of itself was anti-Black. Students were excluded from the schools. And in fact, for a long time, they weren't allowed to learn. As we know, for many of them, they were forced labor, and then eventually chain gang members. And so education was not available to them. Eventually, though, around the 1830s, we have our first HBCUs, we have our first all-Black schools, we have the Hooper Renwick School in Lawrenceville, in which Black communities and families began to prioritize education for themselves. And up until the 50s, going into the 70s, there was a struggle to make sure that Black students had the same access to high quality education as their white peers. And that was a pro-Black, authentically Black mission. And now that we have fully integrated, legally fully integrated schools, what we are seeing is a new segregation, and a new segregation that is leading to some disastrous results of policy and student achievement across the board. For instance, in Gwinnett County broadly, Black students graduate at a rate about 10 percentage points lower than the white peers. That is exacerbated when we look at majority Black schools like Shiloh and South, or Black schools with significant Black populations like Meadow Creek or Berkmar. We see the lower literacy rates. We see the lower test scores. And whereas the practitioners, the policy practitioners making the decisions, like to put that on the Black students themselves, what we are obviously seeing is that this is intentional. These are due to intentional policy decisions, intentional funding decisions, intentional legal decisions to produce an education that is subpar, that is less than, that is inferior. When we look at this, two large areas that we don't have to do much work to look at is special education and the gifted enrollment. Special education and gifted enrollment. We have entered a new segregation. In fact, schools are just as segregated today as they were pre-1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Over half of students of color attend schools with 90% students of color, which means that they're attending schools not only that are very, very segregated, but have less resources, less investment, less funding than their white counterparts. These are policy decisions. And we look at Gwinnett County, we can obviously see the white flight, the gerrymandering, and other policy decisions that have led to these really segregated schools. So thank you, Melody, for setting the context with decisions around housing and other areas, because those have fed into the disparities that we see in the education system. When we talk about the special education program generally, we are looking at overrepresentation of Black students. And when schools were integrated, Black students were purposefully segregated from the classroom and misidentified as a special ed so that they could be moved away from the classroom. And many of them were put into what's called shelter classes and resource classrooms instead of the general education classroom. In these special ed classrooms, students are privy to underqualified teachers. In fact, at Shiloh High School, located right here in Gwinnett County, records show that 79% of its special education courses were led by instructors teaching out of their field. They were not qualified to either teach special education or the subject that they were supposed to be teaching. And Shiloh is only one of 39 metro Atlanta high schools where more than 50% of special education courses were taught by underqualified teachers. And again, let's look at history here. The US government didn't even mandate that education for students with disabilities be taught and be prioritized until about 1975. Again, we're talking about decades prior to that of Black students being misidentified as special ed or not identified as special ed and therefore not receiving their services. Only in 2019 did Georgia require schools to test for dyslexia. This is something that's personal. My youngest brother, who graduated South Gwinnett class of 2020, was identified as dyslexic in the 9th grade in high school. So after years and years and years of learning this disability, which was hereditary, he wasn't identified until high school. And thankfully he graduated within 4 years and has a football scholarship. But there's many, many students that can't even get to their next step educationally because of that lack of resources. A recent study showed that across 11 southern states, Black students are 44% more likely than white students to receive special education services compared to 41% nationally. And so again, over-identification, mostly at white schools, a lack of resources at schools of color. When we talk about the gifted program, 22.79% of Black students are in the gifted program. That means that white students are twice as likely to be recommended and participate in the program. And therefore, Black students are stuck in larger class sizes with lower standards, with less rigor, and an inequitable access to high quality education. Their teachers are usually less qualified and their resources are subpar. But the disparities don't end there. As Melody, as you talked about, one large glaring area is discipline, And simply put, we are fueling the school to prison pipeline. We're ignoring the mental health crisis on the impact as Suri, my student, was pointing out. We're ignoring the mental health of our students. We know that they are traumatized from birth on, and that they need a new set of tools, restorative practices to deal with them. Right now, where we're fighting in Gwinnett County is around whether implicit bias and SEL training should be mandated to teachers. It's very frustrating because what folks don't understand is that SEL without implicit bias is white supremacy with a hug. You're treating white supremacist teachers to be nice and kind, but what we really need to understand is that Black students are not more misbehaving than their white counterparts.
Yeah.
But that classrooms and that local schools have these levels of biases, not only within the anti-Black discipline code, not only on the books, but by practices. We have to understand that a lot of the discipline code is up to the whatever mood, whatever weather that day is. And so these teachers and administrators are allowed to carry out that bias when they're carrying out discipline of Black students, of poor students, of students with disabilities. Again, we see that anti-Blackness within the dress code, within the levels that students have to come to referral, the referrals that teachers can use. This is where Black girls are overjudged for how they dress. Black boys are overjudged for their do-rags. Black boys and girls are overjudged for their attitudes and talking back.
Yeah.
And again, this is where implicit bias comes in. I was reading this great text, and they showed a story in which this white teacher wrote up a group of Black students because she asked them why they were out of their seat. They were going to sharpen a pencil, and they answered to go sharpen a pencil. She wrote them up for talking back, not understanding that culturally a lot of Black families don't teach rhetorical questions. That actually rhetorical questions are a very white supremacist, a white, predominantly white cultural mechanism that's absent in a lot of Black families and communities. And so it's that kind of cultural nuance that we have to grasp. And when we understand that difference in culture, we realize the need for restorative and trauma-informed practices. Right? Again, we're not done. We can look at the curriculum at another large area of disparities that's driving the declining student achievement, the declining mental health of our Black students. And simply put, when we talk about the curriculum, it is intentional that European or white history is mandatory, that Black and ethnic studies are absent or optional, right? I'm sure folks saw the story coming out of Utah this weekend that they implemented Black studies, but they are allowing parents to remove their students from certain lessons and certain units around Black studies. Black studies is optional. And now, what if I was in my world history class, once we got to, I don't know, European imperialism? What if a group of Black parents said, I don't want my students learning that? Would we have the same impact? Would we have the same choice given to those parents? I dare not. But again, this is intentional. This is intentional. After the Civil War, by the 1890s, we had groups like the Daughters of Confederacy begin to stack school boards, PTAs, and they began to pressure publishing companies to adopt textbooks that were favorable to the South and racism, called slaves workers, for instance. Those textbooks and a lot of those groups are still around. In fact, we have one of the descendants of the Daughters of Confederacy right on our school board, Dr. Murphy K. And you can hear some of her language in a recent deposition from 2017. She was asked 14 times about her opinion of segregation, and she replied, no opinion, I do not recall, no opinion, I do not recall, including her opinion on the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Again, that's intentional. It's not that she did not have opinion. She just did not want to go on record, right? But she certainly had an opinion, right?
I was going to say real quick, Anthony, also recently, I want to say it was this week or last week, a statue that was sponsored by the Sons of the Confederacy in downtown Lawrenceville, Confederate statue that was erected in 1993 was just taken down. I want to say this week or last 93. And I once, when I went to go see the statue to make sure that, to ensure that it was actually there, that this was a real thing, they were touring students and teaching, showing students these statues. And that was, and some of them were minorities, and that was one of the statues that they showed them.
Right, absolutely. So this white supremacist framework that we're teaching history, we're teaching all subjects really, is deeply ingrained within our Black students, within our white students. I can't remember her full name, the Amber Ruffin show. I'm going to show my students this great clip from her show this weekend, in which she argues we do need a White History Month, because we need a month where we begin to unpack and unlearn the false narratives in history that we have taught even white students. Even white students don't have access to authentic white history. And so maybe we need a month where we get real and get serious and talk about how George Washington owned slaves, 18 slaves by the age of 18, and wore not wooden teeth, but the teeth of his slaves. How Lincoln maybe freed the slaves, but actually was a bigot, did not believe in the equality between the races. And so as a world history teacher, maybe I'll use some days to talk about some authentic white history.
Oh my God, I gotta jump in here. I can't. I can't stay quiet. You knew it was trouble when I turned on the camera. I'm just saying. Anthony doesn't know that, but Melody does. If I turn on the camera, it's trouble coming. So I will never forget, and this was not in the South, so this just shows how ingrained this is within our U.S. culture. So this was in DC. That's where my kids started school at. And we used to, we didn't have lots of money. So we did a lot of freebie things and everything, all of the monuments and museums in DC are free, with the exception of a couple of private ones that are there. And so frequently that's what we did. So we go to the Lincoln Memorial, and my kids were young. My oldest one was in about, I think, third or fourth grade, third grade, because now I remember the teacher who came at us. And so we went down, we went to the Lincoln Memorial. We were downtown anyway, went to the Lincoln Memorial. And if you go down to the basement, you take the elevator down under the statue, there's a whole wealth of information that you get about Abraham Lincoln. Like, he didn't give a flip about the slaves. And well, I'm sorry, the enslaved people. He didn't give a flip about them. He didn't want to be on record that the union split under him. And it was his family that put all that information down there. Okay. So this came out of their historical records. They had the letters there. If Frederick Douglass was not on his butt constantly, none of that would have happened. He was only bought into saving the Union. And so Frederick Douglass convinced him that the enslaved Black people would come over and fight for you if you were standing up for their freedom. And that got him a little closer. But there are newspaper articles at the time that all of this was going on. That's down there. And my son goes back to school, and I'm one of those people, if I go to the museum or anything that's written, it's at a monument, whatever, we got to read everything. My kids hate me for it, right? They do it now to themselves. But so we're reading all of that stuff, and I make them take turns so that it's going in. They understand what's going on. We can talk about it, ask questions. They go back to school. And my son brings up about Lincoln. And him and the teacher went toe to toe to the point that she then wants to call me. The interesting thing is he was in a Spanish immersion program. So the teacher who's fighting back is Puerto Rican. Okay, the classes were only, the immersion program teachers were only native Spanish speakers. And so this was a young woman who grew up in Puerto Rico. She moved to the US to get her education, and she stayed. Well, to the States, because they're still part of the US, right? So she moved to the mainland to finish her education. And so she qualified to teach there because that was her native language. And so she's pushing back on him. Now you think about the history of Puerto Rico. Really? You really want to push back on these narratives about Black when you know what the narratives are that happen within Puerto Rico? With the Spaniards and all that went on there. Come on. And so finally, my son came home and told me about it. She calls me and wants to know, where is he getting his history? And I said, this is the real history, and you need to start teaching it. And she wanted me to push back and go along with it. I did not, but I'm gonna stop here. I'm sorry, I've usurped the time, but it just shows you just how ingrained this is, how it crosses all sorts of boundaries that are there, and people believe this stuff. I mean, she was rooted in that. Abraham Lincoln was friends of Black people. This is the same teacher who also was mad that at the time we didn't celebrate Kwanzaa, and she wanted to tell me we couldn't possibly celebrate Thanksgiving because we're Black. Well, what do you think we're celebrating? You know, this is the same Puerto Rican teacher who grew up in Puerto Rico. So, you know, all of that whiteness was visited on them, the whole Eurocentric curriculum that they probably had. God knows it's all over their monuments when you go to Puerto Rico that talks about the relationships there, and they're starting to put more truth out. So I'm glad to see it, but you know, that woman is gone. I don't know that there's any helping her, but you know, but that's the teacher that he had in front of him, reinforcing that Eurocentricity, that everything is white is right, and it's got to be told from the point of the victor, and that's not necessarily people of color history. Yeah. And I'm gonna stop here. I'm sorry.
No, thank you for that addition, because those are the teachers teaching in Gwinnett County. Our teachers are close to 90% white, many of them female. And many of them, I teach at Peachtree Ridge, many of them grow up in places like Hall County or Coney County. They grew up in these very northern Gwinnett County. They grew up in these white places. Then they go to the University of Georgia, where they're taught white supremacist pedagogical skills. They come back to the classroom, and many of them, I remember, and also I saw this from your video, World Class for Whom. I remember, I'm so glad to hear this student echo this sentiment. I went to Berkmar High School, graduated 2013, go Patriots. And I had teachers say, I'm only teaching here. I'm waiting for a spot to open up at Grayson, at Peachtree Ridge, at North Gwinnett, right? They are spirit murdering our children because they're charged with teaching an authentic history. They don't even know. White people should be so mad that they have been duped all these years, right? And so when we look at, for instance, at the U.S. History AKS standards in Gwinnett County, we see 40 plus white men listed, many of them U.S. presidents, but others. We see 2 Black men, 2 women. And I know y'all can guess the 2 Black men. Dr. King, Barack Obama. That's it.
I couldn't unmute fast enough to guess them.
That's it. That is it. So what we're saying is that we are disallowing our Black students from grasping their authentic history and representation is having a negative impact on their student achievement. And so what do we do about it? Where do we go next? What does this mean? What is the mandate for educators, for parents, for our community? We've already begun. And so I want to pay homage quickly to some very, very bright and very incredible educators that I've studied, that I tip my hat off to, based on my reading and study of these women. I've begun to develop what's called a Black queer womanist lens through which I teach and I instruct. And that's a fancy way of saying that I recognize intersectionality. And I recognize that within this racial, classist, heteronormative, white supremacist and capitalist system that we live in a lot of ways, the Black queer woman is the most marginalized and therefore has much to offer. That should be at the forefront of the fight, the struggle in education and housing and all the different areas in which we see disparities. Dr. Lansing Billings is one of my models for a teacher. And in her book, The Dream Keepers, she says, culturally relevant teaching is about questioning and preparing students to question the structural inequality, the racism, and the injustice that exists in society. The teachers I studied worked in opposition to the system that employs them. We are not in this fight to win, we are in this fight to struggle, right? And so that's what I have to remind myself all the time. Dr. Love reminds us, and we want to do more than survive, that we are spirit murdering our kids so that when they go on to college and careers, when they take the next step, they're at a disadvantage. They're traumatized, they're less prepared, they're less willing to engage. We are quite literally not just exacting violence physically, like with the children we saw this weekend, we're exacting violence spiritually. And that has long lasting and generational implications. And so what I've been very blessed to do is return to the county that birthed me, that raised me, to begin anew and push us closer and struggle us closer to this world-class education system that we like to talk about so much. So I teach now, I'm on my third year at Peachtree Ridge High School. I graduated from Berkmar High School. I have a master's of arts and teaching, social studies education, specifically world history from Georgia State University. I was blessed to receive a full ride scholarship to the University of Chicago, where I got my bachelor's in political science. And so my background is in politics, it's in government, it's in activism and civic engagement. And that was it was a natural attraction to the classroom. And today I work very hard to create this decolonized, pro-Black, anti-racist classroom that serves all multicultural students. I focus mostly on power structures, on social movements, on racial politics, restorative justice. And those things have allowed me to then prioritize a multicultural collaborative learning community in which all cultures and identities are empowered to see education as a practice of freedom, as Bell Hooks puts it. And I love teaching world history because I can tie these things directly to the curriculum and can't get in much trouble for it, right? And so today, for instance, we talked a little bit about the Super Bowl and the anti-blackness we've seen in the past years. We talked about the blackballing of Colin Kaepernick, but also the long history of Black athletes standing up and speaking out. And we look at Muhammad Ali, we look at Colin Kaepernick, we look at Tommy Smith, we look at all these individuals, Serena Williams, who have used their platforms for social justice and for pro-Blackness. And the students, we also had a great conversation on whether or not they support standing and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, or whether they think that's a personal choice. And they look at both sides. But the fact of the matter is we have to produce Black students who are critical thinkers, who know their authentic history and are prepared to stand up and question, critique, and struggle against the systems of oppression. And we can't really do that without Black educators in the classroom. In fact, studies show across the board that students of all kinds of colors, creeds, social classes, everything prefer Black educators, because not that Black educators are cooler, that they're hipper, but that Black educators are bringing a renewed and a refreshed lens to the teaching environment that white educators sometimes cannot grasp, that Black educators have struggled themselves. And I think I can identify with many of my students. I've been homeless. I've lived in a 2-bedroom with 6 people. I'm the oldest of 4. I've been on food stamps. I've also gone to a PWI. I've also achieved at some of the highest levels. And I can identify with many students who are really struggling with their mental health, with things outside of their control, especially during a pandemic. And that brings me to one of my last points. It is incumbent, and unfairly so, in a lot of ways, for Black educators to use their position to be organizers and activists, but also to push their white colleagues to put their privilege on the line to join them. And so this past summer, it feels like 3 years ago, if you will, but this past summer in June, we began a group called the Gwinnett Educators for Equity and Justice. And we did this in the context of the Black lynchings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, the pandemic and the recession, as well as the failures we saw from spring digital learning. And we began with 4 priorities for racial equity and justice that will be at the foundation of a racial equity and justice policy right here in GCPS. Those include, number 1, a district-wide implicit bias and anti-racist professional development. Number 2, Black studies and ethnic studies courses. Those will be a floodgate to many others like women's studies, Asian studies, LGBTQ plus studies, Latinx studies. Number 3, local school councils on equity and justice, and equity teams. And then number 4, local school plans for the recruitment and retention of especially Black, but also BIPOC educators and administrators. And what inspired me, what has fueled me, was my experience in Chicago. I, of course, have a natural affinity. I was just talking to my mom last night, and I have a natural affinity to activism, to organizing. As the oldest of 4, I guess I don't know when to shut up. And I remember this meeting that we had probably 3 days, or 2 or 3 days after we released the open letter back in June 2020. We had a meeting with Superintendent Wilbanks and his executive cabinet. And he ended the meeting saying, well, next time you don't have to be so loud. And I said, well, Mr. Wilbanks, I don't know what else to do. That in this work, we're standing on the shoulders of all of those organizers, all of those activists, those radicals from before us, Dr. Angela Davis, A. Philip Randolph, right? We're standing on those that have struggled, Bayard Rustin, right? That are showing us the way forward. And we're inching a little bit closer. We're not struggling just to win. We're struggling to get closer to that beloved community that Dr. King believed in. And so I quickly, based on what I saw in Chicago during my ecology years, I worked for a state senator. I also worked for some community organizations, and I got to see the fullness of the political spectrum in the process. And so I want to honor today one of those fallen comrades in Chicago, a teacher and the former president of Chicago Teachers Union, Karen Lewis, who passed away this weekend. And when we look at these different activist teacher movements across the country, she was a trailblazer. The 2012 teacher strike was the blueprint for where you go with a strong union and flexing your muscle to challenge not only Republicans, but Democrats, right? Those that are in power, the power players. I remember watching many of the uprisings and the protests that happened in North Carolina and Kentucky, Arizona, Chicago, New York. And I remember saying that can never happen here. I just can't wrap my mind around it happening here. Our teachers in Gwinnett County are so afraid, but man, they done started something, right? Even before the pandemic and the disastrous decisions we've seen from Will Banks around safety, there were disastrous decisions around equity, and teachers stood up and they spoke out. Not only this past summer, but for years. Organizations like Gwinnett SToPP have been fighting for years to ensure, to realize the world-class education for every single child, for every single low-income child, gay child, immigrant child, bilingual child, every single child. I was timing myself, so there we go, right on time. And so I want to thank those activists and those folks that are plugging in, but I'm also going to challenge you that you join some movement, some action, something, so that we can fight for all of our children right here in our backyard, but also worldwide. So thank you for the time. I really appreciate y'all.
Where do we even start from there? You know, you gave us so much to think about, and
Yes.
I really appreciate you ending with a call to action,
Yes.
because it is so important. And not everyone has to be on the protest line, but you have to be doing something. Like, there are the people who write the letters. There are the people who go talk to other folks. There are the ones who are creating the posters, okay? There's all those different levels of things that have to happen. Create the flyers, get it distributed, join in the capacity that you have to make that difference. And there are lots of ways to do that. And I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit about what the Gwinnett Educators for Equity and Justice are looking for. And then I'm going to tell you what Gwinnett SToPP's looking for.
Absolutely. For those that are looking to plug in, there are a plethora of ways for you to do so, not just on the front lines, but really in the back scenes as well. Currently, we have a petition out that I hope that we're sharing widely, and that I encourage you all to share, that begins to list the reasons and call for the retirement of this superintendent, so that we can begin really truly building the equitable educational system that our children truly deserve. So that petition is out there. Please share it widely, sign it, and read it, and really engage with us on the conversation, because there's a lot of opinions on the financial reasons, on the policy reasons, and this is going to be a very complex process. We haven't engaged with it as a county in almost 25 years, so please engage with us. The other thing that we have going out is an email campaign. There's a template out there, mostly for parents, but for anyone who's a constituent or a taxpayer in Gwinnett County. We have an email campaign in which we're seeking specific agenda items to be added to the February board meeting agenda. Those include a board-sponsored pandemic task force, so resources and a review of discipline with specific recommendations and changes to policy, and then resources around SEL, that's social emotional learning, for our students and for our teachers. And then, of course, it also calls out that daughter of the Confederacy right on our board, Dr. Murphy, who is galvanizing her white supremacist supporters. We saw the board meeting in January, and we want to call out how that is a violation of policy in her role. For her to side with these white supremacists, and that she needs to stop engaging in the propaganda. At the crux of our message this coming February, we are going to protect those who are representing us. We know, I'm from District 5 till I die, raised right here. We know what we were doing when we elected Dr. Therese to the board. We know what we were doing when we elected a Black Lives Matter activist to that board. And we will protect Dr. Therese and Mrs. Watkins because they are there to represent us and they're doing their job so very well already. So shout out to them. But those are our two biggest things. You can also like us or DM us on Facebook. You can reach out by email. Reach out to me personally. We want to make sure that our coalition is strong and vibrant and that is representative of the community, every single corner of it across the land. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Anthony, I don't know if you're able to drop a link for that what the asks are for February into either the Facebook chat for the video or into the Zoom chat, and I'll post it so that folks know. I didn't know about that one. Something got by me. Been having a couple of bad weeks. So I'm not as on top of things. But yes, we absolutely are looking forward to being the majority of the board. So I want to change some language too. We cannot be referred to as the minority. We are the majority. Okay. When you collectively look at the student population in Gwinnett County Public Schools, it's somewhere around 17%, 18% white, and then it's everything else. And so that's not a minority. So I'm gonna change some language. We are people of color and we are the majority. So just so that we have that. And then clean up the link so I get it in. No, I want the petition that you were saying for, is this about the no, I posted that one. I want the one that you have on asking for, was something you were asking for in February.
Oh, right, the email campaign. Okay, so
there you go.
Yeah, but that's coming. I'm drafting the email. That's definitely coming to our partners tonight.
Okay. Okay. Oh, we definitely want to share it. So please make sure that that we have it so we can share it. Gwinnett SToPP is looking for the same things, which is why I wanted Anthony to go first. So we're looking for the same things. We always need volunteers. We are a volunteer-powered organization. So we don't get these things done unless we have boots on the ground, people putting in. So important is we need parent voices at the table. So we help parents to get up to speed on what the issues are, what the policy looks like, and then walk them into the real meetings to be able to say, this is what we want. And I'm so grateful for GEEJ because you brought out that activist spirit in the teachers and really need strong teachers who are in there for our children and looking out for the building. Parents can't be there, we're at work somewhere else, you know? So we need strong allies in that building who are looking out for our children. And this is probably where I get out of pocket, but I want, for my Black teachers, I need you to be my kind and my color. Y'all know what that means. Y'all have heard it all your lives. Black, you heard that before, right? And so don't take on the norms of your oppressor. Remember, we are here for liberation. We only get that liberation through help, support, and education. And that's what we depend on you for. So I'm sorry I had to take that moment, Anthony. I just always have to take that moment. And now I'm gonna shut up and let Melody jump in here.
Thank you, Marlon. Yes, it's really important that we don't need empty representation in leadership. And even as, you know, Anthony has put before, that we don't need unity for unity's sake. We need to unite behind pushing this movement forward, and that Black students in Gwinnett County have been waiting for justice for generations. You know, Hooper Renwick opened up in 1944, and here we are in 2021, still asking and demanding, rather, that Gwinnett County provide equitable opportunity for all students. So I'm so glad that we had this conversation. One of the great things about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it made it more widely acceptable to focus on Black people, you know, and focus on Black experiences. And as Anthony was saying, he works through the Black queer feminist lens. And the point of that is to bring the margins to the center. And so we need people to join and ally with us, to focus, to bring the margins to the center, because if we do that, then everyone is free. So thank you so much for joining us. You see our handles here to reach us at Gwinnett SToPP. And we look forward to seeing you soon and seeing you out there, whether you're protesting or at the school board meeting, or you're sending emails, or you're contacting GEEJ or Gwinnett SToPP. We hope to get in contact with you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Have a good night, everyone.